starting.
There we go. I'm the youngest of, I'm number 15 in my family. And there are two died in infancy older than me and one younger. So in a way I was kind of an only child because my sister was 5 years older. And so I tended to be solitary. I grew up with adults. The other thing in my life that I find very significant when I reflect on it now is that by the time I was about 8, I was herding cows during the entire summer. Our land, our farm had different kinds of land. They had what we call the arable land, and we had 100 acres, which was pretty big for a farm in Ireland in those days. And there's most of it was arable and cultivatable. Then there was bogland. Then there was moor, and then there was meadow, and then there was the River Bann, which was a very big river, quite deep. The bogland wouldn't hold fences, and that's where we grazed our cows. And so we needed people to herd them because they would break into other people's property if we didn't. And during the summer, I'd spend the whole summer alone from the time I was about 7 until probably 15 or 16, herding. And I would spend a lot of time after school when I was in the elementary school, because we'd get home earlier than the high school. So maybe from about 3 o'clock on until about 6:30, I'd be herding cows. And I was alone there with the dog in all weather. And what I realize now is that, first of all, my closest companion was the dog. And you may have noticed that I'm still a companion dog, that I still am very attached to animals, and I did it back to then, and very close to nature, because I was alone with nature all that time. And the other thing was it developed a keen, not so much imagination, I think, as a reflective spirit. I became thoughtful as I got older because I wasn't talking to people around me. I think that was more formative of my life than probably anything else that happened to me. I'm still very grateful for the years that I spent herding because that made me a reflective person, and I think, insofar as I might call myself a writer, a poet, rather than a poet, I think that capacity was born in me at that time. Though I didn't write any poetry until probably about 10 or 15 years ago. The poetry was trapped in me. My experience of writing poetry is that it's not so much I write a poem that I think about and formulate. It's more like a poem comes to being in me and reveals itself. And usually it reveals itself with an image or a phrase. And then I need to build something around that leads up to that phrase. I think I can give an example of that from one of the poems here. The phrase that came to me one day was, "Ancient Mother Mountain." I was on retreat out in San Fernando, and we were surrounded by these craggy rocks and escarpments. And once the term Ancient Mother Mountain came, then there's a necessity to give it a local habitation and a name. And that's what I did by writing the poem that I call In the San Fernando Hills. Ancient Mother Mountain, you are Slemish, and black crag of my sojourn. Your Calvary, your Tabor, and Olive Mount in the ascending gold of sunrise. Slemish is the mountain near my home in Ireland. And here I think I've tried to integrate my experience of coming to the United States, which I did in 1952, and my background up to that point by referring to these various mountains in my life experience. Slemish is the mountain on which St. Patrick herded sheep, at least according to the tradition. And of course, we know that Calvary is the mountain which Jesus was crucified. Tabor is the mountain of the Transfiguration. And Olivet is the mountain from which Jesus left us and ascended to the Father. And so I use the images of these mountains as I try to integrate the light and shade of my own life, the moments of suffering and the moments of joy and the moments of glory. Most of my early years were spent during wartime, which had the effect, I think, of making me tentative about life, because you never knew what the next year, the next month was going to bring. However, something that is very significant in my early years is that my oldest sister got married when I was 7 years old, and she was clearing out a number of things, little empty perfume bottles and things that a little girl would like. And among these things was an autobiography of Teresa of Lisieux, Saint Teresa, without a cover. And I started to read it. And that's when I got the first thought that I would become a nun. But I was going to be a Carmelite. I didn't have very much idea of what all that would involve. I knew there was something called a grill, and I thought it was like the outside screen on a window, that you would be behind all these screens and that people would have to talk to you through the screens. As I got older, things became more realistic for me, and I gave up the idea of being a nun in the Carmelite order. And we had a cousin who was a Maryknoll priest who had gone to China, and his health had broken down after a year, and he never was able to return to the mission. So I decided that I would replace him. And that's where I got the idea of going on the missions. But it was going to be Africa. When I thought about what I would do at the end of my high school career, I was still a year younger than my class. I was 17. But it was a matter of go to the university or enter the convent, because the thought of entering was still in my mind. And by that time, St. Louis had become a missionary community. First Sisters had gone to Africa. I remember the day they came down when I was senior in high school. They came down, and those who were going came down in white habits. And there was a great deal of excitement about the fact that St. Louis were going to Nigeria and Ghana. And so I began to think that maybe after all I would enter with St. Louis, but I still had misgivings, because I knew that I might, if I entered with St. Louis, I might be sent or I might not. And I was determined that I was going to be a missionary in Africa. So on Saturday, we had class on Saturday morning, and in the afternoon we sometimes would stay around to work on sewing. And the sister who taught us sewing probably heard a rumor that I was thinking about entering. And when she got me alone, she said she had heard I was thinking of entering, and she wondered where. And I said, well, I thought I was going to enter with the Columban sisters. And she said, why? And I said, well, they had missions, and I would be sure that I would be sent on missionary to the missions if I entered there. And she said, well, why not St. Louis? But I said, no, well, I might not be sent. And she said, well, do you think you should you not leave that up to God, whether you're sent or not? And that struck me as making a lot of sense. And I thought about it for a few days, and then I changed my mind and decided to enter with St. Louis. The year after I entered, I remember we were postulants and we were out in the garden in Monaghan, lovely sunny summer day, and a young bishop from California came to visit. His name was Bishop Manning. And while he was there, the novice director told us that the decision had been made that we were going to go to California. And I still was not that interested in going. I thought that's a nice thing to do, but I still want to go to Africa. So after profession, I was sent for a year to Rathmines, which is in Dublin, suburb of Dublin. And halfway through that year, Mother General came back from a visit to Africa. She went back to Monaghan, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from me assigning me to California. And that was one of the saddest days of my life, leaving Ireland, because at that time we were told pretty much we would never return. They had to come back from Africa for health reasons every 2 years, but not California. California being the land of sunshine and the land where you could have perfect health. So at some point in August, I think we arrived in California on St. Louis Day, which is the 25th, so it must have been about a week before that, maybe 9 or 10 days. We traveled to Cork and went on board the SS Mauritania. My family decided that my mother shouldn't come. They advised her not to. They said it would be too hard. But my father and brother drove me from Monaghan to Cork. And my father, I think, didn't know what to give me when I was leaving, and he did something apparently that was done in his day. He went out and bought a silver thimble and presented me with a silver thimble, which I still have somewhere in my possessions. I'm not sure where. I was very touched by that because he wasn't given to gestures of that kind. I think the McKeevers are of Scottish descent, and we tend to keep our feelings within and be not very expressive. My mother would have been much more expressive than he. But all of his feelings went into that silver thimble. We journeyed on and arrived and came into to California past San Bernardino, and I was so disappointed. I had heard so much from Mother Ronan about how beautiful California was, and certainly that's not the most beautiful part of California. I thought, this has got to be the ugliest place that God ever made. There were old quarries, and it was brown and dusty, and I was really heartbroken when I saw it, because I still had that memory of all the green of Ireland in my mind, and for me, beauty was green. Over the years, I've come to realize that beauty can also be brown, and that there are very beautiful parts of California, but the train route past San Bernardino is still not one of them in my mind. I think it is significant that here I am today, August 8th, reflecting on my life, and August 8th is the anniversary of my making my first vows. Thinking about dates, I find it fascinating, because whereas a date seems to locate me at a certain time in a certain place, but when I reflect on the events of that date, it transcends that time and place and expands far beyond it into the rest of my life. One of my poems was written out of my struggling with the events of 9/11. And 9/11 is certainly a date that has transcended its time for many of us. I think I can still feel the pain of the news of what had happened on that day. And I can still feel the hope also that emerged as time went on and we began to hear about how people behaved around that time. And so, as a result of that, I wrote a poem called Easter 2002, which was a reflection the following Easter on what had occurred the previous year. Easter 2002. Lent came out of season with a fiery baptism and ashes all over the face of Manhattan. The dust of poverty and wealth mingled in common anguish. Now the ancient Lenten days make sacred our pain, shared as we tread the pilgrim road towards Easter. For salvation's womb is opened by remembering around a cross planted in ground zero. There Christ rises again from the grave of our securities, and the future pushes green tips through ashes turned to soil, made fertile by lives laid down for friends and even strangers. And so we dare to whisper, if not to sing, a gentle Alleluia. I think this poem illustrates what I'm trying to say in prose about time, that time transcends itself. The season of Lent gave meaning to something that had occurred in the secular world several months before that for me. And that is, it brought new life and new hope to something that was so very painful and at the time seeming so very hopeless. I think my mother is the one to whom I owe thanks for that, my sense of the redemptive element that inheres in time. I remember a story that my nephew, who's a missionary priest, tells about my mother. One of my brothers, whose wife was a teacher, was asked to mind the boiling potatoes in a pressure cooker. And he knew nothing about pressure cookers. And he did something very dangerous. To check the potatoes, he took the lid off the pressure cooker and it exploded all over his face. And as they say at home, the word came down to my mother, who lived a short distance down the lane, and that my brother had these terrible burns and that he had been taken to hospital. And my nephew, who was only about 7 at the time, is observing all this. He said, Grandma went upstairs and she stayed for about half an hour, and then she came back down. And she said, Eddie is going to be all right. And he was all right. In fact, I never remember even a scar on his face. So it is that trust and faith that she handed on that helps me at times when things are not going well, that if I wait and wait patiently and do what the event calls me to do, all manner of things shall be well. Good will come out of it. There will be healing. But while we're waiting between the event and the good that can come out of it, that's the time that I think I have least patience. I want to see the results much sooner. And there's a poem that arose in my mind at one point that I think speaks to this. It's called Call to Worship. Body bound, I search for words to home the wide out yonder beauty of autumn, to hearth its colour flamed, smoke-formed holocaust of summer's green. It will not enter my edifice, unworthy to receive mystery into five-windowed finity. It calls me out to wander, pathless in its forest fire, under the grey infinity of ancient rain skies. And a lot of time is spent wandering, I think, pathless, waiting for resolution of something that doesn't seem to resolve itself. Another poem on that same thought, out of darkness, out of the winter silence of a death-dark trinity of days, hope trumpets forth, it is dawn, it is spring, it is Easter, he is risen, hallelujah. So I'm grateful to my mother for that patient trust and hope that eventually things would resolve themselves. And certainly she needed it in her life because she reared 12 of us to adulthood and she grieved 4 who died in infancy. I remember particularly when I was returning to the United States, I'm not sure what year, but it was the last time I saw her before I went back for her death. And she came outside to say goodbye, and I knew that it was very painful for her to see me go. And she said, "You have to do God's will, and I have to let you go." And there were tears in her eyes, because she had always dreamed that she would have me when all the others were gone, I being the youngest. And ironically, I was one of the first to go. And so I left her there, and with a heavy heart. And the next time I saw her, she was on her deathbed. She was knitting a pair of socks for my nephew, who was the missionary priest in the family. And she had one fully knitted and the other one almost complete. And she turned to my oldest sister, Tom's mother, and she said, "Mary Jane, you'll finish that other pair of socks." And I thought, my goodness, I hope when my end comes, it's something as trivial as finishing something like a pair of socks is all that's left to be done, and that I can hand it on to someone else to do. It's hard to describe my mother. She was a simple woman and very quiet. She didn't talk very much, but she had a profound wisdom that was also interwoven with her faith. But she was also quite realistic. My father's faith was different, I think. He was a man of duty, and honor and honesty were the important thing for him. Well, I think I'd like to tell the story about my mother with Paul Weir. She was a woman of quiet courage. And this was a story that was always repeated, or frequently repeated, on the Feast of the Sacred Heart, which is a movable feast day in June. Doesn't always occur in the same day, but whenever it come around, she would be prompted to tell the story. This was probably sometime in 1918, or what we called the Troubles, though I don't know when there was a time in Ireland when there weren't Troubles. But this was after the rising of 1916, and the Black and Tans were in Northern Ireland. They weren't trained police force, but they were just regular citizens who were drafted onto the police force, and they were feared greatly. They wore black and also tan part of their uniform to distinguish themselves from the regular police force. It happened on a certain day that the bread van was at my aunt's shop, and there was a local group who were the early form of the IRA, and they decided that a patriotic act would be to hold up the bread van and rob Morton and Simpson, who were Protestant. And my mother arrived on the scene when one of them, who was probably only about 19 or 20, had been shot by, not by any of the police or the black and tans, but by his companion, who didn't know how to use a gun. And he was lying on the ground, and so my mother did what good Catholics do. She knelt down and she put his head on her lap, and she's saying the act of contrition into his ear, which is a prayer that says, "I'm sorry for all that I have done that is wrong," because this young man was dying. But this time the news had gotten to the black and tans, and they arrived and put a gun to her head. And I remember at one point saying, "Well, what did you do?" And she looked at me like it was "Why would you ask the question? What else would you do?" I went on saying the act of contrition. So I think that they saw she was harmless, and it certainly didn't injure her. But she was able to come through that with just that quiet, I go on doing what needs to be done, regardless of whatever is happening around me. The other story she told was when the black and tans were searching the homes for ammunition. There was an old gun in our house, rifle I think it was, that had belonged to my grandfather, who was long since dead. No, my father's grandfather was long since dead. He had been part of the movement, but the gun was still in the house. And she had heard that the tans were in some of the neighbor houses. So she took the gun and put it onto the mattress in the baby's cot. I don't know which baby was in the cot at the time. It certainly was somebody older than I am anyhow. But she could be resourceful when necessary. I think, well, first of all, I didn't intend to write any of these poems. They emerged themselves and kind of prompted me to write them. But reading them now, I think that they do reflect something that's an important part of all of our lives, and that is living out the Paschal mystery, living the death and rising of Jesus in our own lives. And now we're at that stage of our lives. I think we've all gotten much older. There are no new members coming into the community, and that's a matter for sadness. It's not only that we individually are reaching the end of our lives, but we as an institute here in California are reaching the end of our lives too, collectively. So many of these poems, even though I didn't intend it when I wrote them, can really reference that reality that we're living. Here's one called Midwifing. Spring leaped out of a tangle of moulding leaves and balleted across the earth. Whatever she touched greened to life. Air became a twitter of birds. Grass leaned aside for the birthing of crocus and daffodil. Morning and evening came, another first day in the beginning. So this reflects beginnings, which we now more have memory. We talk about how things were when we began here, and the first days in our personal and collective lives. Lenten longing. Winter trees stretch empty, naked arms towards the frowning skies, but deep in root and trunk they grow pregnant with longing that will birth green hope when Easter comes in spring. So here again we have winter giving way to spring. For us individually and collectively, who are now in the winter of our lives, I think our faith prompts us to believe that there is a new spring beyond our present lives. We don't know what that will be like, but we believe and hope that it will be even greater than all the springs that we have ever lived. I find myself often trying to put together meaning out of past and present, because meaning emerged not just from the choices I've made, but those happenings to which I gave assent. And I think that's probably a significant thought on my part, because a lot of times I think we are inclined to feel that we shape our own lives by our choices. But many choices, absolutely, have we made? Or has it not been events have happened and we've been faced with saying yes and making the most of, bringing something new out of these events? Another poem in which I reflect on past and bring it into the present. That moon that lights and shadows the creviced face of the Wasatch hung over Loch Ness and flung a silver path on its night blue waters. And I, soul riven between then and now, between there and here, hold chalice hands to cup and mingle its severed splashes of light. In my first years in California, I used to go out and look at the moon and think, that was shining on the Largy, where I was born at some point. That same moon is tying together my past, my present. And so I try to accept that and make my own of it and receive it. It's a symbol of my effort to put together those two worlds, because that's an ongoing thing, is putting together the two worlds in which you have lived and in which you have been formed. And that those images, I think, say it for me. Well, I think that's what I see, whether we reflect on it or realize it. And I think not only we sisters are living out the Paschal Mystery, but I think everybody is. Everybody is living out life, death, new life. Married people live it out. Their children are born and they're young and they're little, and then they grow up and they gradually move away. And the moving away I see is never without trauma. Sometimes takes negative forms. And so there's a letting go and a dying to the past. But then if you don't let go of your children, there won't be any new life. They've got to move on and get married and have their children. Otherwise, you never see your grandchildren. I see it in my own very large extended family over and over again. The moving and the letting go. And that's the living out, too, of the Paschal Mystery. I think that's what links us to the laity, because we're all living the same mystery, each in our own particular way of life. When I was entering the convent, it was part of our motto, which we don't use so much now. It was, God wills it, was what attracted me. I never heard of St. Unum, and we didn't talk about St. Unum, even though it was in our tradition, until later, probably when I came to the United States. It was after Vatican II that St. Unum emerged out of our history. What I find wonderful and fascinating, I've been reading some of Pope Francis' writings, particularly his recent encyclical on the environment, and what he is calling from is a unity with all of creation. And that suits me beautifully, since I am so attached to animals anyhow. But I see that as a call for us to expand St. Unum to not just other humans, which are very important, especially other humans who differ from us. But now we've included also all of nature, the animal world and the natural world of vegetation. And I think that bears a meaning, the respect for all of creation, even those parts of creation that we find to be nuisances. The charism, see, is, at least in a large part, expressed and enacted in the mottos that we live, in both God Wills It and St. Unum. After Vatican II, St. Unum, as I said, became the big movement, and it's always a challenge to try to integrate life and to reach out to people who are different from ourselves. The two mottos, because that they may be one is what God wills. So the two mottos come together in St. Unum and Dieu le veut. And both of them are enshrined in Botan's, I can't remember what you might call it, but there's a section in his writings in which he puts those two together, that it is God's will that we may be one. And that's really the charism. A charism is a gift. It is a gift, I think I would call it a gift of a spiritual insight that someone has that's relevant for their times. At his time, it was relevant because it was after the French Revolution. A lot of divisiveness, a lot of division, I would imagine, in France between revolutionaries, their descendants by that time, and the descendants of loyalists, and all of them needing education. And that's the shape the charism took then. Wherever we go, the charism takes a different shape. In Northern Ireland, it takes a particular shape, which is try to work for harmony between religions. In this country, it takes its own shape too. So, whereas the charism fundamentally is the same, its manifestation and the way it is lived out has to be rethought in each new place and in each new time. And so the challenge for us now is, at least in this region, how do we live out the ending days of this region and still relate to the beginning days of the sisters in Ethiopia, the African sisters who are, have begun a mission in Ethiopia, and those who are still working in Nigeria and Ghana. So it's still a lively reality. And also, it's important that how we end our time and our days in California, because the charism also is embedded in history. And we find it by reflecting on our history. I think to create it anew, we need to know how it was created in previous eras. And so someday, when things are ending in some other part of the world, I would hope that they look back and look at how things ended in California and find inspiration from there. The first time I was asked to write a poem was an assignment given in second grade. And I came home and I'm sitting at the table, I think probably crying because I couldn't come up with a poem. And my father said, "Go write this. I have to write a poem and I don't know what to say. And I'm sitting at the table wondering all day." And so that was my first poem, actually not mine, my father's. And I took that to school, and the teacher said, "Did someone help you with that?" And I said, "Oh, yes, my father helped me with it." Oh, she said, "That's okay." She knew my father. I never thought of writing poetry after that for years. In fact, the first poem I wrote was in the early 70s, which in terms of my life is fairly recently. And that was an experience going out to the Benedictine monastery in Valleyermo. And I'll read it. I hope it speaks for itself. It's called Autumn Giving. Rounding a bend in the desert road, I am startled by the yellow gold hosanna of cottonwoods, ringing their praise along the dry riverbed. A week from now they will be silent, stripped and lean against the blue, reminding me that death can be generous and glorious, all their wealth donated to the green resurrection of spring. Usually a poem begins with a phrase that enters my mind and keeps playing itself over. For example, with this poem, the phrase that entered my mind was, ringing their praise along the dry riverbed. And then eventually the words that fleshed that out emerged in my mind, and I wrote them down. And then there is the poem. That was my first poem. Reading my poetry, I've noticed that they practically all are an unconscious attempt to both reflect on the paschal mystery of life, suffering, and death, or rising again, and then rising again. Not that that is intentional either, but that's what I discover in retrospect when I read the poem back to myself. All of my poetry you might call religious poetry. Here's another, and this is about Mary Magdalene meeting Jesus after the resurrection. She met him in the garden place of tombs, walking where sorrow and joy embraced, making one and glorious our dark joys and our bright pain. Another one on a similar theme. Conceived in spring, he came in the winter months, a fragile hope, all bound in swaddling bands. You will find him in the manger places of your heart, in the silence of possibility. The other theme that is woven into my poetry is, of course, nature. Nature is both part of the language and part of the inspiration of what I write. This one, Praying the Autumn, illustrates what I mean. Autumn is a plenteous season when trees surprise us with the yellow gold and comfort of amber. Roadsides make room for fruit stands that heap vegetables too. Sun-warm bounty and earth-cool plenty from the womb of the aging year. The green hope of spring has grown wise and mellow in the summer heat. Mellow us too, Lord, with thanks abundant with the joy of yellow and the comfort of amber, before winter snows tuck the drowsy year to sleep. Winter Praise was written in Utah, where we have snow, and was inspired by a row of aspen trees throwing their shadow reflection on the snow. Winter Praise. This morning, after snowfall, the sun smiled a pale lemon light behind the aspen rows, laying long shadow prints on the white, drawing eyes to gaze their wordless lauds. To Antonia. Tony, I never knew, standing in that place of planting, in the hush, empty of your being, that your falling into the earth would yield such a harvest, a heart harvest, viaticum for our desert wanderings toward the heaven haven of the soul. Christmas draws us to the place where eternity and time embrace, the manger of our longing and our hope.
We spoke last time about the choice of becoming a sister of St. Louis in religious life, but that it's also an ascent to being chosen. What I'm interested in talking about is when young women make that choice, they are also making a choice for obviously a very different way of life, and a life that actually provides so many opportunities and the development of gifts that possibly the more domestic choice would not have given. And I just wanted you to speak.
Yeah. I think I remember when I was entering and I was visiting relatives, telling them that I was entering and saying goodbye to some of them. An uncle challenged me and said, wouldn't it be better for you to get married and have children and, you know, contribute to life here in the world? And I, of course, had some argument against that. Looking back now, I think that answering the call to enter religious life, though it seemed like a sacrifice to many people in the beginning, had a great richness and gave us many advantages that we never would have gotten if we had stayed and remained single or gotten married and had family. We all got an education, and in some instances, very advanced education, according to our abilities. And we got also the opportunity to work with children. So in many ways, we became mothers without some of the disadvantages of all the things that mothers, real life mothers, have to do, like dressing and making lunches and being up in the middle of the night taking care of a sick child. We saw them during the school day, and we hadn't any of those other chores to do. So I think in many ways we chose the better part. We miss giving birth to children, I'm sure. Many of us do. And having a close companion, as our brothers and sisters had in their husbands and wives. But there are many other things that we have that others don't have. So there's no reason to feel that we made any kind of supreme sacrifice. Yeah, I was 17 when I entered. Most people were 18. I was always a bit younger in school because I went to high school at 11. Nowadays they all go at 11, but in those days there were 13 or 14. What happened was I was in a small country school with only about maybe 20 or 25 students, and those in my class were a bit older, and the girls went on to high school, and I was left because I was younger. And come September, the principal in the convent in Ballymena kept sending messages via my sister. I think she didn't realize I was as young as I was, asking my mother to send me in. And eventually, my mother decided, with the rest of the family, I guess she consulted my father, who'd let her make those decisions, and my older sisters. And I was sent in. I was going in late. Others had been in about a month, and there I am in a little blue silk dress where everybody else is in uniform. and feeling very out of it because I was so much younger and I didn't even have the uniform. The first couple of years in high school, I really found it very stressful and was not very happy at all. But eventually I caught up and settled in. Yeah.
And later got your PhD.
Yeah, well, that was the gift of the community, that they educated me as far as I could go. And I enjoyed that and appreciated it. And I love my time in Duquesne University, where I got my master's in religion and personality. The time just after Vatican II, when everything was opening up. Actually, I was there when Martin Luther King was assassinated. Yeah. And forget where it was. Yes, then getting my PhD in Claremont, which was in theology and personality. Yeah, I feel very grateful to the community for giving me those opportunities. And I enjoyed every moment of my study.
But you also taught and were tenured at St. Meinrad Seminary.
Yes, I taught there. My parting with St. Meinrad was sad and unfortunate, but Mercy Sister, there were only two of us, two women teaching in the School of Theology at the time, signed a document asking that women be ordained. And anyway, the Bishop of Indianapolis, who was the former rector of St. Meinrad, raised that question about whether they should keep her or not, and she was fired for the signing of that document. And I felt it was unjust because their constitutions, the constitution of the seminary, said that if anyone was going to be fired, that there would be a committee, it would be reviewed by a committee of the faculty, and that was never done on her behalf. And I resigned mainly because of that. Yes, I do believe that women should be ordained, but I didn't resign because women weren't being ordained. I was hired at a time when they weren't being ordained, so that it wasn't an issue for me in my resignation. It was simply the injustice of not giving her a fair trial, as it were, as the constitutions had provided. And so I resigned. The community supported me in taking that action, and I stayed another year. I stayed a year on in where I'd been living out in the country there, in that beautiful area in southern Indiana. And at that time, I spent the year turning my dissertation into a book, which I published. It's on the addiction to prescription drugs in women. It's called A Pastoral Response to Addiction to Prescription Drugs in Women, of which I was aware from having worked for a time. I did an internship in Pomona Valley Community Hospital in the alcoholism unit. And a number of men were in there recovering from alcoholism, and their wives were there recovering from addiction to Valium, which they were taking to cope with their husband's alcoholism, probably. So it was, in the long run, a worthwhile year. I got that done, and I mightn't have done it if I had continued teaching there. But I did love southern Indiana and enjoyed teaching. I always have. But after that, after that year, I was hired by Bishop Niederauer, who surprisingly was a friend of the rector who had perpetrated Sister Carmel's being fired. And he hired me to work in Salt Lake City in the diocese, which was wonderful. I enjoyed that for, I think I was there about 8 years, and then finally retired and came back here. We came across the country by train. We came by boat across the Atlantic. And ironically, the train stopped in Salt Lake City for a long stop, and we got out, and the heat, it was the month of August, and the heat was overwhelming, and I jumped back in very fast. But it's kind of ironic that I didn't ever anticipate that I was going to spend 10 years of my life in Salt Lake City and really love it there while I ministered there in the diocese. The other thing that was ironic to me is when we crossed that time, of course, we wore these long, dark serge habits. And many years later, in the 70s, I found myself driving back from southern Indiana across the country, same time of the year, very hot, and I'm wearing shorts in the car. And I thought, who would ever have believed that such a thing would happen? So much change came, external change in religious life. But parallel to that external change that came with Vatican II in the 70s, there was also an internal change. We were no longer making our meditation all together at 6:30 in the chapel. We were making our meditation on our own, and we were choosing the subject that we would make it from. We weren't meditating from a common book. Now we could choose to meditate on anything. And I remember the first time I discovered meditating on a poem, and it was The Wreck of the Deutschland by Jared Manley Hopkins. And I had been teaching it, and then realized, the depth of the meaning of the poem. And sitting in the car on my way to college on a Saturday morning, I was making my meditation on the road, and I opened The Wreck of the Deutschland. And ever since that, I more frequently meditate on poetry than I do directly on scripture. Of course, it always is, as my poems are, an indirect relationship with scripture. Prior to Vatican II, there wasn't so much attention given to matching your gift with your ministry. You might be sent to do nursing. Thank God I wasn't. I would have dreaded being a nurse. Or you might be sent to teach when you would have much preferred to be a nurse. That was before Vatican II. And from that time on, a real attempt was made, and a successful attempt, to place us in the ministry that we were suited for. I never had any problem with that, because I think I would have been a teacher, maybe I would have been a teacher. I also thought of being a lawyer, because my brother ahead of me was a lawyer. But I was quite happy being a teacher and teaching English, which was my favorite subject. One of the big changes with Vatican II was the Mass in English instead of Latin. And I can remember my mother, the first time she went to Mass in English, I was with her, and I wondered, how she'd take to that. And when we came out, she turned to me and said, "I really enjoyed that Mass, and it sounded like what you would say coming out of a restaurant after a very good meal." And so I was extremely pleased. But I think for some people, some did miss the older ways. I took to the Vatican II changes fine. At first, I was a little apprehensive, not knowing what would come about, but once we started making changes, I never really had any real difficulty with them. Certainly was glad to get rid of the habit that was extremely hot, especially in this climate.
You told a funny story about your sister and her husband visiting Monaghan.
Oh, right. When I was still in the novitiate, one of my sisters, Rose, came with her husband to visit. And when they walked in, Rose looked around and said, "Look at this, look at all this establishment, and all done by women." And her husband turned to her and said, "Yes, but there's a man above." And I'm thinking now, with our expanded view of who God is, she probably could have replied, "Who said it was a man?" But we still weren't thinking of a God of the different gender, or even a genderless God, which is probably much more accurate than that. But I still remember that as a kind of a funny moment between the two of them.
You mentioned that you felt in support of the idea of women being ordained. Tell me about the genesis of that thought in your mind. Or
I think it started when I was in Claremont, because there I was with other religions who ordained women. The Claremont is mainly Methodist, but there were also Episcopalians there. And I think that was the point when I began to become a kind of low-keyed feminist, would say. I think began to open my eyes to other dimensions and to question things that I hadn't questioned before. And out of that came my realization that there's some reason why are women not being ordained. I mean, if you baptize us, why not ordain us? And I still have that question. I don't know whether I particularly would have chosen to be ordained if women were allowed. I'm not sure whether I would have, but I thought, and I still believe, that women should be ordained. I don't see why not.
is there anything that you want to say about what you feel about the Sisters of St. Louis here, and sort of a certain era passing? And
Yes, I think that is providential, because had we remained large numbers the way we were before Vatican II, the laity would not be so much engaged in ministry and in the church. And what I see us being replaced by the laity, and I think that's a blessing. Yes. Religious life in the United States and in Ireland is dying. We are not getting new members. It's coming to life in Africa, though eventually, take another 25 or 30 years, it may be where we are now. And all of that, I believe, is part of God's providence, because we are passing on what we did in ministry to the laity, who are well able to do it. And the situation now is reversed. There was a time when Louisville would have had mostly sisters teaching and a few lay people, and now it's mostly lay people and a few sisters. And though there's a certain sadness about the diminishment in religious life, I think there's a great good that's coming about, that the laity are taking and being given their full place in the church.
family, I'm always struck when you go back to Ireland, you have a family reunion at which about 100 people can't make it, and yet there's still 250 people there whose names you know.
Yeah, that's true. And we've just had a few more at it since I mentioned that. Um, yes, the family gets bigger and bigger because, well, 9 of the 12 of us married and had children, and they had children, and their children are having children now. So in fact, they're at that gathering the last, and I never will be back again. That was though I didn't think about it at the time, that was my last time in Ireland. And I'm sure that's probably why they had the big gathering, because they knew too that it would probably be the last time that there were that 250 family members, their spouses, their children, their children's children from all over. And I was estimating about at least 50 who couldn't make it. That's a real mystery and an extraordinary thing, how families spread and develop and do so many different things in so many different parts of the world. It's something for which I'm very happy, because I see them all. What I'm happy to see is that they all have a concern, a social concern, and they live it out in different ways. I don't expect any of them to become sisters. I'm pretty sure none of them will. But I do know that some of them will be off in Peru helping to build houses, and that whatever careers they choose, there'll be careers in which they'll be helping other people. And that's a part of my heritage that I'm proud and happy to see being passed on from generation to generation.